Today I have the pleasure of welcoming historian and author Sophie Bacchus-Waterman to the Anne Boleyn Files. Sophie's just written something truly groundbreaking, the very first full-length biography of Elizabeth Boleyn, Countess of Wiltshire and mother of Queen Anne Boleyn. For centuries, Elizabeth has lingered in the shadows of history, often dismissed as simply the wife of Thomas Boleyn or the mother of Anne, Mary and George. But Sophie's meticulous research reveals that she was far more than that. A woman with a distinguished career at court, influential connections, and a role in one of the most ambitious families of Tudor England. Her new book, Elizabeth Boleyn, The Life of the Queen's Mother, shines a long overdue light on Elizabeth's story, and it changes the way we see not just Elizabeth herself, but the entire Boleyn family. So join me as I talk with Sophie about her inspiration, her discoveries, and what it was like to piece together the life of a woman who has, until now, been almost invisible in the history world. I know you're going to find this as fascinating as I did. So welcome, Sophie Bacchus-Waterman, to the Anne Boleyn Files. It's absolutely lovely to have you here to sort of celebrate your forthcoming book on Elizabeth Boleyn. So a big welcome to you.
Thank you, Claire. Very excited to be here. Very excited to chat about the book.
Yeah, I think it comes out, I checked on Amazon earlier, and I think they said in UK and Europe, so on the Amazon site for me here in Spain, it was the 23rd of October that it's coming out.
Yes. All being well, 23rd of October.
Yes.
I'm currently editing the proofs at the moment, so fingers crossed that doesn't delay anything. But
I'm sure it'll be fine. And people can pre-order it at the moment, can't they?
Yes, it is available to pre-order at the moment.
Yeah.
Remarkably, it was doing so well on Amazon when it first came out. Got to number 3 on the most gifted medieval biographies.
That's really good.
So
Congratulations.
really exciting. Thank
you.
Yeah,
I mean, the book, the full title is Elizabeth Boleyn, The Life of the Queen's Mother. And I just think it's, it's wonderful. So congratulations on this fascinating and truly groundbreaking book. I had the pleasure and the honour of having a sneak peek of it, having an advance review copy, and it's just wonderful. But first, before we go on to the book, could you just sort of introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about yourself and your background as a historian and an author?
Certainly. I'm still getting used to hearing that as an author. It's very exciting. So I was born in Tunbridge Wells, which some people might know is a short distance away from Hever Castle. And one of my earliest memories is going to Hever with my grandma, actually. And it was so lovely. So I think growing up where I did, you can't really escape the story of Anne Boleyn and his, the Henry VIII and the history of that and everything. But I took a very circuitous path to becoming a historian. I did an undergraduate degree in creative writing first. So I always wanted to be an author, but more of fiction. That was kind of the direction I was going in. Once I finished my undergraduate, really wanted to work with old books, rare books, because I still loved history. So I did a master's in book history. And towards the end of that master's, Kate McCaffrey's research into Anne's Books of Hours came out, and that just caused such excitement. And I thought, it's amazing that these books can still produce that sort of new knowledge, even about somebody as famous as Anne. And so started to really get more back into history, back into researching Anne Boleyn, and really picking up that past love, if you like. And it just all really took off from there. So I haven't been doing it very long, and I think sort of bursting onto the scene with a biography of a woman that people thought it was impossible to write a biography about Elizabeth Boleyn. It's quite a bold move. Sometimes I wonder, if I've bitten off more than I can chew. But that's how I came to do this now.
So I was going to ask you what first drew you to Elizabeth Boleyn as a subject, because, she's either completely ignored in things. I'm thinking fiction here. I mean, like the Tudors series, which, is based on history, but it is a rather fictional retelling. I don't think she even appears in that.
She doesn't, no.
Then there's the other Boleyn girl, the film, with Kristen Scott Thomas, I think, plays her. And she's in that at the forefront and quite manipulative. So you either get this baddie Elizabeth Boleyn, or you don't get her at all, or she's just she's so overlooked. So what drew you to Elizabeth in particular?
I think it's because she is overlooked that I wanted to find out more. I'm sure that a lot of people interested in Anne really want to know more about her mother. Who could this woman be who raised someone like Anne Boleyn? And why don't we hear much about her? And so I wondered if it was possible to know more, because I thought surely someone will have done this before. And there are all these mentions in secondary sources of Elizabeth. I'm thinking specifically of Eric Ives's biography, where he says, Elizabeth served in Catherine of Aragon's household, but we know very little about her movements, for example. And that was it, these fleeting references to Elizabeth in secondary sources. And as you say, no appearance in the Tudors, which may be for the better, actually, given how much they vilified Thomas. I think that The Other Boleyn Girl is a great kind of portrayal. You've got some portrayals where she's there but doesn't say anything. I'm thinking of The Spanish Princess, I think. She's there, Thomas speaks at her, she doesn't have a line. I think he tells her to go somewhere and then she goes off screen. Even the docudrama, actually, The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family, there's a couple of great scenes at the beginning of that where again, Thomas reads out the letter that he got from Anne when she's at Margaret of Austria's court. And Elizabeth has no lines. She's kind of spoken at and then she disappears. And so I found that, as I was looking into Anne Boleyn, there were these fleeting references to her mother. And I just really wanted to know more. And it seemed to me like such a gap in scholarship and such a thing that I think a lot of people would be particularly interested to learn more about her if it was possible. And then I found that it was, actually.
Yeah, I think people assume because, she just gets these glancing references, in works like Eric Ives, and we know what a lot of work he put into his Anne Boleyn biography. You kind of make the assumption that there mustn't be these records, there mustn't be any records on her, otherwise he would have mentioned her more. So how do you go about writing about or researching a woman where, there perhaps aren't the obvious kind of records? So yeah, you're a bit of a historical detective, aren't you?
I think that's a really nice way to think about it. That's sort of what it felt like a lot of the time. So my first step was to see, okay, what is immediately available when you go looking for direct references to Elizabeth? Because I think that it's correct to say that there aren't many in court dispatches, for example, the dispatches of ambassadors. There aren't many there are no personal letters. We don't have a portrait. So looking for direct references was my first step. And then because of the research of other historians, I knew that there were these mentions to Elizabeth being in Catherine of Aragon's household. And so it was stringing together those references and trying to work out what her role might have been in the household if she was in perhaps ordinary service, meaning she lived at court, or extraordinary service, meaning that she only went to serve for specific court events like christenings, funerals, that sort of thing. And so once I'd gotten together those references about where we knew where she was at specific points with direct references, then it was a matter of filling the gaps about where we could only assume where she was. So, for example, she leaves Catherine of Aragon's service in 1522, and then we lose her until 1525. And so she must have been at Hever and Penshurst. And so then it was filling that gap, thinking, well, what would a woman of her station running a household like that do with her time? Where would she go, and what were the kind of duties of a woman of that station? And so really that was how I filled the gap. Where we didn't know where she was when she was in Catherine of Aragon's service, it was a matter of looking for where the ladies were, because there Elizabeth would have been, probably. I think there was careful speculation to fill those gaps, but they were surprisingly easy to fill. Elizabeth turns up a lot in Catherine of Aragon's household in lists of members of the household, and New Year's gift rolls is a really good example. And she's there constantly, which means she probably was at court constantly. And so once I'd sort of filled out that timeline of her life, there's so much information about her family because they're the Howards, obviously very famous. And one of the earliest things that I discovered was the dramatic arrest of her father after the Battle of Bosworth, the death of her grandfather, and then the arrest of her father and her mother trying to petition Henry VII on behalf of Elizabeth's father, who had been arrested. And the letter that Elizabeth Tilney, Elizabeth Boleyn's mother, writes says that she's with her children on the Isle of Sheppey. And so you think, well, they must have gone from Ashwellthorpe Manor, their house, to the Isle of Sheppey. What might that journey have been like? And so writing around and finding out about the family, finding out that her sister died in childbirth as well, that added another personal touch. Her brother-in-law dying in the Regent ship sinking was another thing. The more I found out, the more I realised that it wasn't just about Elizabeth, it was also about the life that she led while Anne was away, before Anne came back to England. And there was just so much detail there once you just shifted your view a little bit to the side. So yeah, it was a wealth of information. It was very rewarding, I think.
And she obviously had a very distinguished sort of court career apart from her children, herself. But is there anything that you found that going through the sources that really surprised you about Elizabeth, about her career or about her home life, anything that you found that surprised you?
Yes, I think even for a figure as shadowy, I think a lot of people describe Elizabeth as shadowy, and I think that's true. Once I started to spend time with her, I really felt like I got to know her. I think a lot of people who write biographies feel that way about their subjects. And there was a lot that was surprising. Probably one of the most surprising things was how much Elizabeth probably was present for with regards to Catherine of Aragon's queenship. There was kind of the public duties of being a lady in waiting, so the jousts and tournaments and dances and things like that. We have a lot of records of those. Edward Hall was a great source for that sort of thing. And then it was thinking about the spaces in between where we know where Catherine was and her ladies probably would have been with her. So for all of Catherine's pregnancies, miscarriages, those terrible times, only women could be in the room with her. And if Elizabeth was in ordinary service, then she would have been at court for those times and possibly could have been with Catherine of Aragon. We don't know the names of the women who were with Catherine of Aragon, just like we don't know the names of the women who were with Anne when they gave birth. And so you can speculate that Elizabeth was there. I think that was, once it allowed for the possibility, it really opened up a lot of avenues for consideration, I think. Once you sort of put Elizabeth back in the story and think about her life before the Great Matter, before Anne came back to England and before all of that really kicked off, there was a lot, I think, that was particularly surprising and just very interesting.
It's just struck me that, Elizabeth might have been there for all those, the stillbirths that Catherine went through and seeing Catherine go through that, but then also seeing Catherine being replaced, by her own daughter. That's
Yes,
just
I
must
know.
have been.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And we can only speculate because I haven't found a trove of letters. I don't know how she felt about it, but it must have been such a difficult thing to go through to have served one queen. And we know that Elizabeth's first appearance in Catherine's service is 1509 at the coronation. It's her first appearance in a court document. It's really exciting. The image is going to be in the book. She gets some material to make a dress. She and her sister ride in a carriage together. And then she's consistently mentioned in sources until 1522, where all mentions of Lady Boleyn stop. Until she returns to court as Anne's chaperone. So that's a long time. And obviously she wouldn't have been there all the time, but she would have been there for a significant portion of that. And that's just fascinating to think about. That's an awfully long time to be in Catherine of Aragon's service, to be a potential confidant, to be there for these dramatic moments. Yeah, it's very interesting to think about.
Interesting at 1522, the sort of same time that Anne comes back, that Elizabeth moves out of court. Yeah, that's interesting timing.
Yeah, I think when you start to consider the timing, it's also the time that I know some people have dated Mary Boleyn's tryst with Henry VIII to that year. So it's possible that that had a hand in Elizabeth leaving court. We just don't know. But yeah, it's very interesting when you consider the timing. Something else as well that I found particularly interesting thinking about Elizabeth's time in Catherine's service. There's one household record in particular that lists all of the women in Catherine's service and livery that they're being delivered. And on that list, it says ladies in presence too. And the only two women on that list who are mentioned are Maria de Selenis and Elizabeth Boleyn. And that really makes you wonder. It's unclear what ladies in presence kind of was as a particular role, but if you look at the household records of the household ordinances of dukes and kind of large gentry households, a lady in presence was somebody who helped the woman of the lady of the household in the morning when she went to say prayers in the morning, carrying her train, helping her dress, being a really kind of, the title really suggests a kind of intimacy. And the fact that only the two women who are listed are Maria, a close friend of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth Boleyn really makes you think about what Elizabeth Boleyn's role might have been and how close she might have been to Catherine of Aragon, if only we had the surviving sources to really tell us more.
Yeah, that's intriguing. Yeah. And what do you think Elizabeth's role was in the rise of the Boleyn family? Do you see her as an ambitious woman, politically savvy, or do you think she just got swept along in the rise of her family?
I think that she was certainly more politically savvy than we've allowed for. I think she must have picked up an awful lot from her family, from her mother, who was certainly in service to Anne Neville, and from her own time in Catherine of Aragon's service. I think she would have had a lot to offer once Anne became queen. But even during the rise, when Anne was receiving the love letters from Henry VIII at Hever Castle, Elizabeth was probably also at Hever Castle. Henry even mentions her in one of the dispatches. He says to Anne, you wouldn't come to court either with your mother or in any other way, or something like that. The exact wording, can't remember. But that means that the topic of Elizabeth has come up. The topic of Anne being chaperoned at court has also already come up, which I think is very interesting to consider, because we know that Elizabeth did chaperone Anne. One of the few mentions, in fact, I think the only mention that she gets in a letter from Eustace Chapuis, says that when Anne, Henry, and Norris went to go and look at the belongings of Wolsey after Wolsey's fall at York Place, Elizabeth accompanied them, which is, again, fascinating. One of those rare instances where we get a specific mention to Elizabeth, and it tells us, why did she go? Perhaps she went as a chaperone to Anne and nothing more, but she must have had a personal stake in that. She must have perhaps felt triumphant that Wolsey had fallen. Perhaps she bore a grudge, much like the say Anne did, about the splitting up of Percy and Anne. We just don't know. But it's a very intriguing reference to Elizabeth at that particular time doing that. And I think the problem that we have is that a lot of the sources that, or rather, we don't have the sources that we need to tell us Elizabeth's involvement in the rise, because she must have been having conversations with Anne behind closed doors. She must have been involved in ways that just don't survive in the records, that ambassadors wouldn't have written about, that Henry wasn't aware of. They must have been having conversations and strategic meetings that we just aren't aware of, things that took place at Hever or at court that we don't have the sources for. In their new biography, Julia Fox and John Guy speculate at one point that the Boleyns had a kind of a triple offensive during that time of Anne's rise, where you had Thomas Boleyn at court, Elizabeth Boleyn at Hever, and George Boleyn as the go-between. And that's really interesting to think about what Anne and Elizabeth might have been talking about, and what they might have been, just these private conversations that haven't survived. Yeah, I think she was
it's
much more
just
involved.
a shame that we don't have Anne's letters to Henry to fill in a lot of those blanks, because as you say, Elizabeth is mentioned in the letters. We know that George was the courier for some of them, so there obviously was a lot of Boleyn involvement. It wasn't a secret between Anne and Henry, was it? It was definitely known by Anne's family. So it's interesting to speculate just how involved Elizabeth was. I'm sure Anne would have confided in her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure they had meetings about what to do about it all.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. So how long has it taken you? I mean, you're still working on the book, obviously, doing the final edits and that. How long has it taken you from deciding that you wanted to do this book, the research, the writing? How long has the project taken you?
It took me almost 3 years. So I started in earnest at the end of 2022, just doing kind of the initial research, secondary sources. I was lucky because I had a lot on my shelf already. Um, so that was very helpful, just kind of considering it and thinking about it, putting together a timeline. So yeah, really, almost 3 years. Yeah, it's been a long, long process. Um, yeah, well, I think I'll be sad when it's over though, because I'm sure that, you've written so many books, it just becomes your life for such a long time when you're looking at a particular subject or, a particular period. It just really is everything. So it'll be bittersweet, I think, when it's finally out there in the world.
Yeah, I think you feel quite empty at the end of a project. So I try and move on to something straight away to fill that gap because yeah, you feel strange at the end of a
Yeah.
book. Yeah. I want to ask you actually about sources now because you've mentioned a few sources, like the love letters. You've mentioned Edward Hall, one of my very favourite sources, his Chronicle. So,
Mhm.
what sources were the most valuable to you in researching Elizabeth for your book?
Mhm.
And were there any unexpected gems, any sources that you hadn't even thought were sort of there that actually gave you lots of information? I think you mentioned the New Year's rolls.
Yes, the New Year's rolls were very helpful. The list of household members were very helpful as well. I think we've got about 3 or 4 surviving of those. And so seeing where Elizabeth is and then when she drops off as well, and then perhaps being able to fill those gaps with the New Year's rolls was very helpful. There are a lot of records at the National Archives. I'm quite lucky I have access to state papers online through my job at St John's College in Oxford. So that was very useful. Um, Various letters kind of filling the broader narrative um, of the family and or perhaps of events at court. That was particularly useful. Elizabeth mentioned a few times in the Lisle letters. She seems to have had correspondence with Honor Grenville, Lady Lisle, but those letters again, where are they? Um, and they exchanged gifts, which was very helpful. Little mentions here and there for direct references. Something that I found that was really surprising that I didn't find until quite late in the project were the pay books of James Needham, who was the Surveyor General during Henry VIII's reign. So helpful because they list all of the repairs at various palaces across the country. And when you comb through those, as I did, there are a lot of references to Elizabeth Boleyn during Anne's queenship, various repairs to her household, um, various repairs to her rooms at court um, throughout Anne's reign. And so that was very helpful because she must have been more present than we've allowed for if she had rooms there that were, being repaired. And that was a really interesting insight. And she's kind of referred to invariably in those as Countess of Wiltshire, sometimes the Queen's mother, which was lovely to see. Um, so that I think that was a real hidden gem that I didn't find until quite late that really added just a fascinating little window into her presence.
Because I think a lot of people assume that she was just at Hever or that she was just visiting on occasion. So
Yeah.
yeah, very useful.
I think that's the case with a lot of the kind of consideration that people have had of Elizabeth, that she must have been, this quite reclusive woman, that she must have always been at Hever. And that is, I think, down to a lack of evidence. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. She could have been at Hever for those periods, but quite likely she would have been with Anne at court for a lot of that time. Certainly during Anne's early queenship, Anne would have wanted her mother there to rely on her. So that's when you start to see it through Elizabeth's eyes and think about her. You put Elizabeth at the center of the story, and suddenly it makes a lot more sense what her movements probably were. And then, when you're lucky, the evidence bears that out, like the repairs to her room, um, or various mentions at court, that sort of thing.
I think Elizabeth has been sort of rather unfairly judged. I think Thomas has as well, with especially with regards to the ends of their children. Um, people blame them for not stopping, trying to stop the executions, and for not being around, for perhaps taking refuge away from courts. And I think a lot of people think that the Boleyns were quite cold and just let their children take the fall. Um, what do you think about Elizabeth, perhaps particularly at that time, and the Elizabeth of your biography? Perhaps you could sort of describe who she is, who you found.
I think that I found somebody who's much more headstrong than we've allowed for. Given her heavy kind of political involvement in the events of Anne's queenship and her time in Catherine of Aragon's service, I really felt like once I'd finished writing the book, I'd kind of gotten to know somebody who was much more politically savvy and involved than we've thought. And I think Anne obviously respected her a great deal. We have several references to Anne mentioning her mother. Speaking of Anne's fall, she mentions her in the Tower. One of the first things she says, "Oh, my mother, thou wilt die with sorrow." And Anne obviously respected her. And I think, given what we know about Anne, Elizabeth must have been a woman worthy of that kind of respect, especially when you consider the fact that Anne spent so much time of her youth away from England and away from her mother. To come back in adulthood and to still have that close relationship, I think speaks volumes about the kind of person that Elizabeth Boleyn would have been. Quite an intelligent, I think, shrewd political person, but somebody who did seem to care deeply about her family and about her children as well. A good example of this, I realize I'm going off topic, I'll go back to the fall in a minute, but now that you've sort of got me thinking about the kind of Elizabeth that I found, there's a reference that often makes it into secondary sources about Anne, where Elizabeth recommends Elizabeth Barton serve in Anne Boleyn's household. Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, I'm sure a lot of the listeners know, prophesying against Henry, prophesying against Anne, was arrested. And after her arrest, from her own deposition, she says that the Queen's mother wished that she serve in the Queen's household. And that is kind of mentioned a bolt out of the blue, one of those rare references that you sometimes get to Elizabeth Boleyn in secondary sources. And without context, it's like, oh, it's a weird thing to say. Why would she do that? Until you think about it within the context of Elizabeth's life and a bit more broadly politically, it makes sense. Because Elizabeth Barton was an enemy of the Tudor regime, somebody who'd been publicly disparaging the king and disparaging this marriage. And it makes sense for Elizabeth to suggest that that woman serve in Anne's household and publicly walk behind her at events, be, a servant to her in that capacity. It kind of neutralizes that threat that Elizabeth Barton would have represented publicly. And when you think about it a bit more broadly as well, she could have been following the example of Catherine Gordon, who was the wife of Perkin Warbeck, who after his arrest was put into the service of Elizabeth of York. And again, publicly, that means, they're no longer a threat. This threat to the regime has been neutralized. And so that, I think, is a very good example of the kind of political canniness that Elizabeth Boleyn must have been able to offer Anne during her time as queen. And I mean, to pivot to think about Anne's fall as well, I was afraid to write about that. I know that you've written about it so much. And, when I came to that point in the story, I was thinking, gosh, it's going to be so hard. I felt like I'd really gotten to know these people, as I was writing about them, these giants of history. And when you come to Anne's arrest and her downfall, we know, as you said, so little about their movements. One thing that I found that was particularly interesting, and it is about Thomas, is that after Anne's arrest, she asked Kingston, do you know where my brother is? And Kingston says, oh, I saw him at Whitehall. And Anne said, my father is. And Kingston said, I saw him this morning. I mean, not those exact words, but, he says he saw him that morning, which speaks to me of somebody who was a father who was taken completely aback by the arrest of his children, who was at court that very morning that Anne had been arrested. Very interesting to think about at what point then they left after that, when they got the news, when they left, we just don't know. Thomas, Eustace Chapuis claimed that Thomas wanted to serve on the jury for his children. And obviously, you know, it's Chapuis, right? Reporting every rumour that he hears. Who knows if it was true? But that's, again, another really interesting thing that I haven't seen a lot of people consider. They say that he was on the jury. Obviously, he wasn't. I'm sure that, you know, your listeners will know. He wasn't on the jury of his children, but he wanted to be. And taken out of context, I think that perhaps suggests a coldness. You know, the people who say that Thomas was on the jury, oh, he must have been a terrible father, he didn't care about his children. Or he wanted to be on the jury because he would have known by that time that they probably were going to be found guilty. And that it may have been the last time that he got to see them and hear them. And I think when you think about it like that, from a human perspective, it's suddenly a lot more emotive. We obviously, you know, we don't know where they were and when they found out the news. I wasn't able to glean much insight into, or in fact any, into where Elizabeth was. Or the last that I found her at court was I believe it's the 14th of April, just over 2 weeks before the arrest, the last mention that I have of her. And in that letter, it's mentioned that she does have a cough. You know, that's another one of the things that a lot of people mention when they kind of talk about Elizabeth, is that she had this cough around about the time her children were arrested. And it's possible that that made her withdraw from court, that she wasn't there for the joust. But I speculate in the book that she would have been for that May Day joust, because George was in that joust. Anne had just suffered, you know, such a terrible loss of her own with the miscarriage of her son. So why Elizabeth would have withdrawn from court between the 14th of April and the 1st of May, I don't think so. I think that she could very well have been there for that joust, and possibly even on the day of Anne's arrest. It's speculation, but I think, like a lot of Anne's life, it's a familiar story, but we've left her mother out of it, you know, rather than allowing for the possibility that she was there, kind of accepting, oh, we don't have the sources, therefore she mustn't have been there. I mean, it's possible, but we don't know. And so why not veer in the direction of they were very close? It's probable that Elizabeth was there. Perhaps on the day of Anne's arrest, we don't know. But yes, I've talked quite a lot. I'm sorry. That was a long answer.
No, I want to know. And actually, that's piqued my interest in what do you think? I mean, quite a few people argue about Elizabeth and Thomas actually having some kind of, like, splitting up, some kind of separation after the falls of their children. What do you think about that?
I think, like a lot of thoughts that people have had on Elizabeth, it comes from a lack of surviving sources. You know, I think it comes from a place of silence, because, and I mean, the only evidence that we have in my mind to suggest that is the fact that they weren't buried together at Hever. You know, Elizabeth was buried in the Howard family chapel, St. Mary's Church. So I think that that's where that comes from. But it was already a family chapel by the time Elizabeth died. So it's more likely to me that she was buried there because it was the family chapel. Perhaps her brother, Thomas Howard, wanted her buried there. We just don't know kind of why she was put there and not at Hever. But that's the only evidence, I think, to suggest that they were at odds after the deaths of their children. We've got a couple of letters from Thomas after that. And the most intriguing one to me is around about Christmas of 1536. He writes not from Hever, but from Penshurst. And I speculate in the book that he and Elizabeth moved from Hever that first Christmas because they would have had a lot of memories of spending that time with their children at Hever. And so possibly for that first Christmas, it was too painful to have those memories. And so they moved to Penshurst from Hever to do the first Christmas there. We don't know if Elizabeth returned to court after the deaths of her children. Either often it's claimed that she did, but I don't think that she did. She certainly wouldn't have got a position in Jane Seymour's household, and there would have been no reason to go back either. I don't think she would have wanted to. Thomas had to, and you know, there's quite a few references to him going back to various things at Edward VI's christening and, you know, Jane Seymour's funeral. but I don't think Elizabeth did go back. There's a letter, I can't remember who it's from, and I believe it's 1537, where I believe it's Thomas Worley writing to Lady Lisle saying, if I see my Lady of Wiltshire, I will tell her such and such news. And that has been used as evidence to suggest that Elizabeth was back at court. But I think if you see it as him saying if, not when, then perhaps Elizabeth wasn't there. So I think, they would have been separated, Thomas and Elizabeth, because he would have had duties to tend to a court and she would have stayed at home. But I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they had some kind of separation. I think it's really hard, with the loss of children. It can either bring you close together or separate you. We just don't know. Yeah, I think that argument comes from the fact that Elizabeth they were buried separately, and there's a lack of surviving evidence to suggest otherwise.
I think there would have been court gossip actually if they had split up. I think someone would have mentioned it gleefully.
I think that's a really good point. I hadn't considered that. Yeah, no one mentions it.
No.
No one mentions that happened, and I agree with you. I feel, they do sort of fade into the background, don't they, after what happened? It's so strange to think about how it must have been, what people must have thought, suddenly they were the center of the universe, really, the center around the whole court orbited around them, and then they were just gone. It's fascinating to think about. And I agree, I think there would have been some gossip had they separated. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Especially some mention, I think, when Elizabeth gets buried, some kind of mention around that day. I just can't imagine them separating and it not coming up somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I agree with you that the church, it was a well-known sort of Howard family chapel, especially the Howard women. So
yeah, I think that's probably why Elizabeth ended up there. And aren't we so lucky that we still have the ledger stone as well? Of standing there and looking at it. Yeah, it's remarkable that survived. It really is.
Yeah, it's brilliant that the Garden Museum took it over and it didn't get demolished.
Yes, yeah.
So during your research, did you discover anything that changed your view of other Tudor figures, like Anne, any of the Boleyns, or Henry VIII himself through, your research into Elizabeth?
I think, we have a disappointing lack of evidence about Elizabeth's relationships with George and Mary. But what I found was a lot from Anne, actually, mentioning how much she cared about her mother in a letter to Bridget Wingfield. There's one point where an ambassador, I believe it's Jean du Bellay, says, Anne doesn't want to leave her mother at Hever. Various references to Anne and Elizabeth together, often, especially during the period where Elizabeth was chaperoning Anne. There's a scene which often makes it into biographies of Anne, where Anne and Elizabeth sort of stop Heneage, one of Wolsey's men, and say, we're owed some fish from your pond. And that's the only time that we really hear Elizabeth kind of speak for herself. And I loved it. I loved thinking about that from Elizabeth's perspective, because it really goes to show that she was there supporting Anne. And again, when it's mentioned in biographies of Anne, it doesn't really make sense. You're like, oh, there's Elizabeth popping up again. But then when you think about it in the broader scope of Elizabeth being there to support Anne, to make sure that she's kind of given her due, it makes much more sense. And so I think really I was surprised by how close they must have been, how much Anne must have respected her mother's opinion and her insight, and how much Elizabeth must have been supporting her during her rise to queenship and then, her queenship, and how much Elizabeth must have offered her. I think that was really quite startling, because I think we like to think of Anne as like this strong woman, this strong kind of proto-feminist, right, who didn't actually get on with a lot of women. Thinking about her relationship with Jane Boleyn, she falls out with her own sister. We don't really think about Anne and women having positive relationships with women. And so considering that through Elizabeth's eyes, it really gave me a new insight into Anne. I think that it's added a whole new understanding, I think, of Anne.
Yeah, it's nice to think that Anne had her mother there at those points, because I think sometimes you see Anne as quite a lonely character at times, going through, the great matter, and in her reign being, yeah, lots to
Mm.
cope with, and if her mother was there to support her, I think that's really poignant.
I think it is, and we're sort of shown that in fictional portrayals. To go back to fictional portrayals, right? Anne is sort of seen as this lonely figure. Um, if she has ladies in waiting at all, I'm thinking of the Tudors, they sort of follow behind her. None of them are her friends. You don't really see her with anybody. Perhaps she confides in her brother, but that's always used against them at the end anyway. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about the real Anne and the kind of people that she must have had around her, including her mother. Um, so yes, I was surprised to find that there was quite a lot from Anne herself. I think one of the few things we can say about Elizabeth for certain is that Anne cared about her deeply and respected her deeply, because we hear it from Anne herself. Um, so yeah, I think that really changed my opinion.
And if you could go back in time and meet Elizabeth, one moment in her life, what moment would that be? And what would you talk to her about? What would you ask her?
I think I'd love to see her on the day of Anne's coronation, because we know that she was there. There's a kind of dispute about, where she was, particularly in the procession I talk about in the book, but she was there. And I would just love to know how she felt about it. Did she know about um, Mary's relationship with Henry? What did she think about Anne becoming queen and sleeping with the same man that Mary had slept with? What did she think about Anne becoming queen after Catherine? Did she want it for a daughter? Was she nervous? Or, did she think that it was God's will, perhaps, that Catherine had failed in some way, that it was kind of Anne's right to become queen? I think Anne sort of came to believe that herself. So I would just love to know what she thought on that day, right? A day of triumph, a day that must have been very triumphant, but it must have been quite frightening as well, because Elizabeth knew how, from her own father's experience, her own family's experience since her childhood, how quickly you could fall from grace, and to have seen it happen to Catherine as well. Yeah, I would love to talk to her on that day in particular.
Yes, I often think that if I
Mm.
went back to chat with Anne or to see her, it would be around the coronation time or the coronation procession, or, just to see that moment of triumph and glory and celebrations around it. Yeah. I'd like to move on to your kind of your writing, and do you have a writing routine? Are you very disciplined? Do you spend a certain amount of hours at your desk, or do you just write when you're in the mood? How do you do it?
I'm not as disciplined as I would like. I'm sure that everyone thinks that. Um, I work full time, so I mostly write in the evenings and on the weekends, especially when the bug really takes me, and you're like, oh, you're really onto something. You found a new research rabbit hole, or the writing's just going really well. So it's mostly evenings and weekends, and I tend to sort of do it when I want to. I think that for this book in particular, I knew I had a deadline for the first draft being done, and so I did work quite kind of diligently on that. For it bursts at a time for a couple of hours here and there. Yeah, but I wouldn't say I'm particularly I'm not particularly rigorous when it comes to that routine. I think there's quite easy to get burnt out as well. Um, Particularly when you're doing a lot of original research, or you've got, a lot of research trips to do. National Archives and the British Library, I was always there. Um, yeah, so I think
And a
quite as
special place? You're always your
mm.
desk, or
Often my desk. I do quite like going to the Radcliffe Camera, just because they've got a lot of good secondary sources there. That's quite helpful. But yeah, often here, with a cup of tea. I have a particular mug. This is my Tudors mug that I get out when I'm trying to, be serious and work quite hard, put on
I
some
was going to say
prescription.
tea, coffee, or wine
Yeah.
while you're working.
Oh, tea,
Obviously, tea,
tea. Yes, tea.
tea.
Lots of too
Okay.
much tea, probably.
And an inspiring soundtrack in the background, or do you like silence?
It depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a particularly emotive scene, I do love the Tudors soundtrack. Oh, I love the Tudor soundtrack. I think that, people can say what they like about the historical accuracy of that show. The music was beautiful. I find that quite inspiring and good to write to. It's so dramatic, a lot of it. And then sometimes if there's something that's particularly more complicated or more involved, then I can only write to silence. It can be quite distracting. It really depends what I'm writing.
Yeah, I agree with you about the Tudor soundtrack. It's amazing.
It is.
And do you plan to write about other Tudor women when you've got Elizabeth, when she's done and dusted? Do you have another Tudor woman in mind or a Tudor figure?
I do. I think that one thing that writing about Elizabeth has shown me is that you can learn a lot about figures that we thought were kind of impossible to know. And I think I'm really excited, there's a lot of women that I'd like to write about and discover more about. Catherine Gordon is one in particular. I mentioned her earlier. Fascinating, right? That whole story, amazing, incredible, very touchy subject. Obviously, Princes in the Tower, Perkin Warbeck. People feel very strongly about that. Margaret Boleyn, I would love to, find out more about her. Um, there's a lot of figures, I think, who it would be fascinating to pay a bit more attention to and write more about.
Oh, Catherine Gordon, that would be a good one. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Margaret Butler Boleyn, another one.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
I'm intrigued by her final years when she seems to have moved
Hmm.
in with the Boleyns.
Yes, I speculate on that as well in my book and Elizabeth's involvement in her care and when she might have moved to Hever and things like that. I think that's also another very important relationship of Elizabeth's, um, that must have been quite central to her life as well, her relationship with her mother-in-law. They all lived at Hever together. I'm sure it was a very busy place, a very bustling
Yes.
place.
And
Yeah.
with Thomas being off doing diplomatic work and
Yeah.
yeah, it would have been Elizabeth sort of being the
Yeah.
constant there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of women. I often think of the quote from Lauren Mackay in her Thomas Boleyn biography that people would be forgiven for thinking the Tudor court consisted of like 5 people. Um, but of course, there were so many figures and so many, women that I think have been overlooked. Um, I'm sure that somebody will pop up eventually.
Yes.
Yeah, once Elizabeth is done and dusted.
And what do you hope that people take away from your book?
I hope that people feel like they've gotten to know Elizabeth by the time they finish reading it. That's really how I felt once I'd done the research. I felt like she kind of come out of the shadows, if you like to use that term shadowy that we used earlier. I would like people to think that she was more involved in Anne's queenship and more involved in Anne's life than we've allowed for. And to just sort of see that really familiar story through a new lens, um, and allow for the possibility that Elizabeth was more involved and more present, I think. Yeah, and really feel like she's no longer this sort of fleeting figure. Because I've done other interviews, I've had a fair few now. I think people are quite excited about the book, which is wonderful, quite stressful, but very exciting. And often people comment in the comments of these interviews, and they say, "No, oh, how have you done this? It's not possible. There's nothing to say about Elizabeth." And I felt by the time I'd written the book, you know, this was possible. And there is a lot more to say about Elizabeth. I really hope that it sparks conversation and thought, um, about who she was and her involvement in these very famous, well-trodden events.
Yeah, what I love about your book, having read that early copy, is that it is about Elizabeth. It's not one of these books that you buy as a biography of a person and
Yes.
then so much of it is padding. Yours actually, you found things out. You flesh her out, and I love that. I
Thank you.
think it truly is a groundbreaking biography. You should be very proud of yourself.
Thank you very much. I went in specifically thinking I didn't want to do that because I also have been disappointed when I bought particular books, like, oh, I can't wait to learn about this, understudied figure. And then you think, this is just an account of the situation or, the events around them. And then occasionally they'll be mentioned. But I specifically didn't want to do that when I wrote this book. I think, really important to kind of not let Anne take over, not let Henry take over.
Mm.
Um, and I say in the introduction, I'm sure that anyone reading a book on Elizabeth Boleyn is quite familiar with the events of the Great Matter and kind of the political machinations around that. That is not this book. There are many other books about it. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth's infamous brother, he barely features in the book because he got a biography in the 1960s, dreadful man that he was. And yeah, I felt very strongly that I had to keep Elizabeth at the centre of the story. So thank you. That means a great deal. I'm very glad that you think that.
Okay, now a slightly off topic, fun question. You're having a dinner party and you can invite anyone from the Tudor court
Yes.
to your dinner party. Let's limit it to 3 people. That might be tricky. Who would you invite?
Oh, Thomas Cromwell, definitely. I would like to know how involved he was in Anne's downfall. What was the situation there, right? I think it would put an end to all of those speculative books about his involvement and who did what. So I'd love to have him there. I'd definitely have Anne, of course. And I'd imagine that I've already had my tea with Elizabeth Boleyn. So we'll put her out of the way and we'll say Anne, Thomas Cromwell, and Mary. I think Mary Boleyn, because she's another figure who there's just nothing. I would like to think that there could be a fully fleshed out biography of Mary someday, but there seems to be even less on her than there is on Elizabeth. So I would really like to sit down with Mary and just get to know her about, what she thought about everything. How long did her relationship with Henry last? What did you think of what happened with Anne? Why on earth did she marry Stafford? Just everything. I'd have a lot of questions.
Yeah, she's another shadowy figure.
She is, but she's even more shadowy, I think, than Elizabeth. Maybe I'm saying that because I've written my book on Elizabeth now. But there seems to be even less on Mary. At least we know where Elizabeth is buried. We don't even know where Mary is. It's fascinating to think that she was at the centre of so much, and yet even less remains.
Yes, the Queen's sister, and she just disappears, doesn't she? Really, I mean,
really.
we know about her death, but not to know her resting place just seems very strange.
It does, yeah. It seems very strange that there's nothing there. We've got that one letter, of course, and I think a lot of we're sort of talking more broadly now, but I think a lot is made of that one letter that we have to Cromwell. It's the only time we really hear her speak for herself. But a lot has been made, I think, of quite little. So I would love to get to know Mary Boleyn. I think that she's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Okay, and I think final question: dream historical site to visit or revisit on a research trip?
So I'm going to Scotland for my birthday in a couple of months, and I can't wait to see kind of all of those historical sites. We're going to do Stirling Castle, we're going to do Holyrood Abbey. There's a lot of kind of sites that I'm not sure we're going to go to yet, but I'm sure there's a lot there. I'd love to see. I would love to see kind of those. Can't wait for that. I went to Penshurst Place. So having grown up in Tunbridge Wells, I went to Penshurst Place on a school trip when I was maybe 10. And they got us to all dress up as servants, and we pretended to be servants for the day. I haven't been back since then. So I would love to go back now with the context of having written about it and considered it as a place where the Boleyns were. I really must make that trip, I think. I would love to go. I go to Hever quite regularly, but not Penshurst.
Oh, Penshurst is beautiful. And to go back, knowing that they spent that Christmas there. And just to take that in, that'll be quite moving. I think I get moved going around Hever when you start thinking about it being their family home and the kind of discussions that happen there and the grieving that might have happened there.
And I think it's amazing as well, somewhere like Hever to have survived as it does. It's amazing to go there. It really does. You feel quite transported as well. Have you seen the new Boleyn apartments yet? I've not.
I haven't. No, I haven't managed to get over to the UK and see them.
Yeah, I'd love to. I can't wait. Yeah.
Yeah, I only seen pictures, but I'd love to go over and see them.
Yeah, they look wonderful in pictures.
So the book comes out in October, so it's on pre-order now, isn't it? So
Yes, it
where can
is.
people get hold of it? And do you have
Yes.
any events, talks, or are you doing anything for the launch?
So it is available on Amazon, Waterstones, WH Smith, all of the kind of bookshop websites. Um, and in terms of events for the launch, I don't know about a book launch specifically. I am doing a talk at Hever, unbelievably, doing a talk at Hever in September as part of the Simply Tudor Tours Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn um, tour. So that's very exciting. That's in
It is
September.
amazing to do a talk at
Yes.
Hever.
Oh, I
You
bet.
feel that it's
Yeah.
such an honour.
Yeah, it really is. I'll be talking about Elizabeth and Thomas's kind of final years after the death of their children. So yeah, very much looking forward to that. That's the 13th of September. Um, and then I've got an as yet undated talk at Canterbury Waterstones in January about Elizabeth and the book and the research and everything. Besides that, I don't have anything planned at the moment, but people keep an eye on social media. I'll post about events around the launch. I'm sure there'll be quite a lot that will come up.
Well, huge congratulations on your book, and I can't wait to read people's responses to it because I
Thank you.
think it is going to change so many people's views on Elizabeth and the Boleyn family as a whole as well.
Yeah,
So huge
thank you very much. And
congratulations.
thank you for your help with it as well. It's
And thank you
invaluable.
for being so giving of your time to do this interview.
Of
So
course.
thank you so much, Sophie. It's been wonderful having you here, and thank you for your wonderful answers to my questions as well. So thank you.